I was recounting this story where I got arrested at an airport. And one of the funniest things was they thought I was smuggling drugs, basically. I'm a smart guy, but I do things for the dumbest reasons. I mean, why I chose that particular PhD at that particular university was nothing to do with food or the science I was doing. I essentially wanted to become a comedian. I was basically cooking these potatoes, and as I was boiling them, I leant over the pan and I smelled the steam, and it smelled like hot chocolate. And so I had this light bulb go off. I was like, there must be something in the potato skins, presumably. Some chemical compound that is mirrored is also found in chocolate.
So hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Fugitive Chefs Podcast. Today we have Johnny Drain, or actually Dr. Johnny Drain, joining us. Hey Johnny, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Furqan, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. No, it's the first time we are actually virtually meeting. I mean, over a video call. We've spoken a few times, and actually, tell me about. Firstly, what is your connection to food? Like, what is the earliest memory of a connection to food that you can remember?
Wow, earliest connection. I'd have to think about that. I mean, I'm from the UK, which is not often. It's not part of the canon of supposedly great, national cooking cooking nations. And I grew up in a town called Birmingham, which is in the middle, which is also typically seen as an unglamorous part of the UK. So perhaps my culinary prognosis was not destined to be good, but I grew up in a family where we didn't, my mum didn't love cooking or food really, but we certainly ate a lot. And yeah, we had the calendar of a particular year was marked by special occasions where my mum was from a slightly bigger family. She's one of five, where all of those cousins and aunts and uncles would gather at someone's house, and there would always be food, whether that was like, Easter or Christmas or bonfire night or, these various other times. So there was always food and feasting and celebration. And, I had grandmothers I would cook with. And so, yeah, I guess somewhere along the line, I picked up this passion and love for cooking. My parents were actually pretty good at letting me and my sister into the kitchen, and from a relatively young age, and we would sort of just cook stuff for ourselves and cook for them and make cakes and these sorts of things. So yeah, I guess I realized that A, I had a certain aptitude for it, and then B, being in a kitchen was was a sort of a special, friendly, enjoyable, relaxing place to be. And I guess my subsequent career in food has stemmed out of that early passion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the atmosphere helps, right? I mean, the atmosphere of like having that, as you explained, in your family with your grandmothers and family being interested in cooking. I think most of the people I interview through the podcast, it's very common. I mean, nobody has this typical story of my grandmother cooked something and then I said, teach me this recipe. But again, it's always some kind of like interaction, formal, informal, with food in the family. I think mostly.
Well, for a while, I always felt this was probably going back like 10 years when actually I was, we could talk about this, but my entrance into like actually sort of earning a living via food was relatively late. And I think I always thought that you had to, and I looked at some of these great chefs or cooks that I admired. A lot of them had these deep, like Marvel superhero backstories where, I don't know, they were intimately involved, their parents, their grandparents, or where they came from with these like iconic places of food, or they had these very close connections. And I always felt like, well, we weren't cooking anything special at home, and I felt like I don't know, a degree of like embarrassment or shame around that. And then I've over the last years met a bunch of chefs, Rasmus Monk, who's the chef alchemist. I met him a few times, and I remember seeing him talk about saying that he didn't really come from a family where food was a big deal. I was like, oh, okay, you can come from these sort of more innocuous foodie backgrounds and still develop this love for food. And I think there's a few other chefs I've met along the way who similarly, like, their parents didn't love food. It wasn't like the be all and end all of their family life. And so I think I got more comfortable with that idea that food was was significant, but it wasn't this major theme of my family life.
Well, that connects. I mean, what you've said just now, like I know many people who are also like some like single mother households or single parent household where like there's nobody actually cooking and food is just whatever gets by, and then that's why the person has tried to build that skill because it's survival, and that's how people have got into it. And that brings me to the point of the podcast that there is no single way to approach this field. There's no one uh, degree of involvement into the industry. Neither the starting is like starting the entry point to it has to be a certain way, neither the end of it or whatever the career how it progresses has to look a certain way, because most of us grew up with this, as you said, all these icons and all these superheroes who had a certain, yeah, starting from grandmother, then typical pot wash, and then growing up the lines, leaving, getting into things uh, apart from cooking, coming back to it. So the idea of the podcast also is to interview people who have yeah, made their own way, and somehow I feel that can turn into these superhero stories, which someone doesn't have to like exactly copy what Johnny Drain does, but it could inspire that their strange is actually not that strange. It's pretty much accepted, and there's a way to get to it. So
Mm.
starting from that journey, like how you mentioned, seeing around your house there's food. To I remember, I don't know if it was you or who was it who had this Instagram. I think it was you. You had this Instagram bio, the Walter White of fermentation. That was you, right? Because that's not there anymore.
No, I changed it. Although weirdly, when I was recounting a story, some friends came over down. We live on the coast in Kent now. It's actually called the Garden of England. It's this relatively big county, and they grow lots of like apples and asparagus and all sorts of other things. It's basically the closest you can get to France without leaving the UK, and so the climate is a bit more suitable to growing various fruits in particular. And well, I was recounting this story where I got arrested at an airport, and there were no charges pressed, and nothing bad happened, and I'd done nothing wrong. But one of the funniest things was they thought I was smuggling drugs, basically. And at that time, my Instagram bio said the Walter, like it was the food fermentation and food design. And obviously they'd they were analyzing my bags, and they claimed they'd found traces of drugs on these bags. And I was just sweating, thinking, oh no, if they look at my Instagram, because I was describing what I did for a living, and they didn't believe me, because they were like, that's not a job. And then I had, I travel with me um, lots of kit for fermenting. So I have these
Yeah.
temperature controllers, and I have bags of like green and brown and off-white powders. And they were going through this, and they were like, what is this? And they were sniffing it, and they had the dogs out. And anyway, it looked very hairy for a little bit. I had these pictures, spending the next 20 years of my life in jail reading lots of books. Um, but so that my Instagram bio said that. And then I changed it, I don't know, a while ago. But then after this conversation last night, I was like, maybe I should change it back, because that is a pithy, snappy line that kind of
It
just
is.
gives an insight into who I am and what I do.
Definitely. And I mean, for me, that's the biggest challenge. I mean, challenge or like the opening into this podcast, because most people I interview over here, I can't define them by a title. I can't say, okay, that's a doctor or a nurse or a physician I'm interviewing, and it's profiles like you who have carved this own definition, So like for somebody who doesn't know you, I think most of the listeners would know what you do. But just tell us, like somebody, I mean, I don't know if a far lost cousin asks your mother what you're doing, what is the definition?
Yeah, I mean, I do still struggle with that kind of that pithy. If you're a doctor or a teacher or a lawyer, it's very easy. You say, "I'm a lawyer," and then someone says, "What part of law do you do?" And they say, "I do like marine law," and you're like, "Okay, I know what you do roughly." I don't have that sort of 5-second pitch, or even for me, my 30 or 60-second elevator pitch is also long, because where I sit now, I actually have fingers in a bunch of different pies. But essentially, the label I'm probably most comfortable with still is scientist, just because I have a formal qualification in science. So I studied chemistry and then material science, and I did a PhD in material science. So I feel like I've earned that. But arguably, I'm also I'm an entrepreneur these days, and I'm kind of a food scientist, and I'm like work in food innovation. So I'm kind of a researcher, and I design products as well. So I'm kind of like a food designer. So normally I just it depends who I'm talking to, and I figure out which label is most well, ultimately which is most beneficial for me to describe myself as. But
Hmm.
scientist or entrepreneur, food designer, I guess, are the ones that I wear most often. And basically, I mean, I'm a thinker and an ideas guy, really. So I normally the thread that combines my work is talking to people and kind of connecting the dots, maybe where there are disparate ideas or concepts, and then maybe other people haven't been able to connect these dots, and I go in and connect those dots. So that's a bit of an abstract way of describing it, but what I've done over the last 10 years is basically go and work with the best restaurants and bars in the world and set up R&D facilities and do food innovation, so create new products or create um, familiar products from unusual ingredients or familiar products from familiar ingredients, but using different new routes and protocols and methodologies. And I kind of create stuff. But I also do a lot of like storytelling, which is weird for a scientist. You know, we don't often think of scientists as being great storytellers necessarily, but actually a lot of the work I do these days is to do with communication. So communicating complex science, distilling it into a form that the average person, you know, might understand. And then another of the threads, I guess, along with those ones I've mentioned, would be playing in this world of like food waste and circularity and um, zero waste. So fundamentally, like making better use of the
Hmm.
things that we've spent lots or someone has spent a lot of time creating, whether that's you know an animal or you know a bag of rice or whatever, making the most of these resources that we've created.
Mm-hmm. You're super interesting. I mean, all these, yeah, niche of careers that you've carved onto yourself, like the kind of services that you would say provide for a potential client as an entrepreneur, I think it's pretty unique. And that's also, I think, the beauty of yeah, using this multidisciplinary approach where people see value in something, even though they are say you know these leading restaurants, for example. Why would they like look outside? And it's this people like you and these profiles that have like kept restaurants and many industries looking into, okay, maybe these guys who have a little bit of each field might yeah, be able to contribute to these fields. And as you mentioned, your most formal qualification, I would say, is the PhD, and that was Oxford, right? If I'm not wrong. What
Yeah.
was the vision with like material science? Why material science? Was it already like, did you already know you will connect that to food, or why did you get into that?
You know, I mean, when I look at my, you know, I am objectively like I'm a smart guy, but I do things for
Mm-hmm.
the dumbest reasons, um,
Mm-hmm.
so much of the time. So really, I mean, why I chose that particular um, PhD at that particular university was nothing to do with food or the science I was doing. I
Okay.
essentially I wanted to become a comedian. So there's this thing called the Oxford Review, which is I mean, I guess I don't know how old it is, but it's like 50 or 100 years. And lots of my favorite comedians, um, you know, went to Oxford and then were part of this Oxford Review. And it's this kind of stepping stone if you want to become a comedian in Britain, being part of that Oxford Review, or there's this thing called the Cambridge Footlights. Similarly, like lots of you know Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, and like Stephen Fry, and all those sorts of people were part of the Cambridge Footlights. So anyway, I basically I really wanted to become a comedian, and I thought, you know what, I'll go to Oxford, and I'll do this PhD, but on the side, I'll join this Oxford Review, and that'll be, you know, finish the PhD, and then I'll go and become a comedian. Anyway, I trialed. You know, you have to try out for it, and I think I don't know if I had to submit something that I'd written or I did like an acting um audition, and I didn't
Mm-hmm.
get in. And I was really gutted. I was heartbroken. But anyway, so that I didn't. Then I was writing some bits of comedy, but I went through this PhD, and um, actually after it, I was writing some kind of screenplays for sitcoms, but at the same time, I was also working in food and my policy was actually that I would pursue, there was sort of comedy, food, music, and I would pursue all of them until one of them sort of took off. And ultimately, food was much more successful than the other things I tried my hand at. But essentially, that PhD was, I wasn't really motivated. It's kind of a bad thing to say, but I wasn't motivated by the subject matter hugely itself. It was more of a means to an end. I kind of wanted to go to that particular university. It's a very special, very interesting place, and there were these sort of side hustles that I wanted to pick up whilst I was there. And so I picked this particular degree, which had nothing to do with food, the research I was doing. Yeah, here I am, sort of 10 years later.
And funnily enough, like I know people now who are working in food, actually in fermentation, and connecting it to material science and like finding of materials through scobies of kombuchas and in those line of things, you know.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's an intimate overlap. Don't get me wrong. I mean, my work was, well, it was very theoretical. I was building computer models, and the
Okay.
materials I was looking at were actually steel. So you're definitely not edible, but for sure, like material scientists are now definitely, this field of biodesign and uh, even food design, where we can make useful materials out of things that grow, and also um, you making useful materials out of things that are byproducts of food. So, there's companies like Pina Tech who make this sort of vegan leather out of um, pineapple stalks, and obviously loads of people now making packaging materials out of like fungi, and there's loads of cross pollination between the world of material science, which is kind of a blend of chemistry and physics and engineering, and then the world of food and biodesign and biomaterials. It's very rich, and actually is, I would say, more vibrant now than it was 10 years ago when I just finished my
Mm-hmm.
PhD.
Oh, definitely. And like considering for me, like when I look at you, from all these things that you do, I think the most that sticks out to me is all your contribution to fermentation, especially like guiding restaurants to take that path and like using substreams, byproducts, and things like that. And fermentation being a language which converts these resources which are not seen as resources into resources which can be, yeah, implied into a restaurant. So what was your first like interaction with fermentation? What moment, any project that you remember that got you into fermentation? Was it a choice or just happened to fall in your laps?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really interesting thing about fermentation for lots of people these days is how it's easy to not see where fermentation is in our kind of fridges and larders and on our plates. So, my first interaction would have been, I think, making yogurt with my grandma, or maybe, we actually made bread at home with instant yeast. And somehow in my head, they were, bread is bread and yogurt is yogurt. And they were filed somewhere. Even when I started learning about fermentation, they were filed in sort of different places. But I remember, I'd finished this PhD and I started working in restaurants in the UK and at home back in Birmingham, and moved back into my parents' house. And then I got this position at NOMA / the Nordic Food Lab. So I'd agreed
Huh?
to go and do this research project on butter, uh, looking at, well, culturing the cream before you churn it to make the butter, but predominantly looking at whether you can age butter in the same way that we age cheeses. So,
Mm.
a Parmesan that is 36 months old is typically more expensive than 24-month Parmesan, and that's because it's had more time to develop various, flavor characteristics. And my idea was, well, why is no one doing that with butter? And there are a few examples. There's a Moroccan butter called Smen, which is aged, and there's a few other references you can find in sub-Saharan Africa of aged butter, but predominantly people are not aging butter, and the language in the words we use in English are to describe butter that is a bit old, pejorative, they're negative, so rancid
Yeah.
and acidity.
Mm.
And in Romance, other European languages, it's also typically pejorative language. So that was my gateway into the Nordic Food Lab. And before I went there, I'd started sort of making lacto ferments. But in my head, I think I still saw them as very different to the bread I'd made or the yogurt I'd made many years previous. And then when I got over people like Josh Evans, who
Mm-hmm.
they just released this paper this week or last week, this miso in
Yeah.
Spain. So him
Mm-hmm.
and Maggie Koblenz, who's awesome, and a few other people named on the paper who basically made miso, sent it up into space.
Space. Yeah.
Actually, I don't know if they actually got some astronauts to make the miso in space. I haven't read the paper yet, but I know that that work's been cooking for a few years. But Josh was there, and Josh is obviously was brilliant then and is brilliant now. And so he was. I hadn't made koji at that point, and so he had this dried koji and these koji spores, and I was culturing the butter. And in the basement of the boat, the Nordic Food Lab, they had all of these insect garums from this big insect project that him and a few other people had been working on. So yeah, it was whilst I was there really that I started connecting, seeing this fermentation as a whole, and then also understanding it as a being a subset of sort of preservation and distinguishing in my own head pickling from fermenting and these various other techniques, and then kind of really wrapping my head around the microbes that might be involved and what needs to be present versus not present. And yeah, that was the start of my journey into fermentation, really.
And at that point, because yeah, I mean, I've met Josh before, and I've like heard about the story of Roberto Flor and the Sky Lab, and then turning it Nordic Food Lab, getting into DTU. At that point, when you were at the Nordic Food Lab, how connected was it to Noma? Was it just like projects which are happening by themselves, or are they being implied into the restaurant at some point?
Yeah, I mean, I was there, I guess, an auspicious moment in the Nordic Food Lab's history because it was. I mean, I went over in the August, and in December was when we moved the food lab off of the boat and into the space at KU, Copenhagen University. So that was the point where, um, the Nordic Food Lab separated formally from Noma, the restaurant, and then obviously by that point, Ariel Johnson and Lars Williams had already set up the shipping containers behind the on the other side of the original Noma. So they'd already got the fermentation lab up and running, and were doing, all sorts of awesome things there. So actually, when I went over, it was a kind of a funny time because we were obviously part of the restaurant, but I think obviously the projects were somewhat divorced, let's say, from the what was happening in terms of the restaurant's R&D. And I think Thomas Freebull, who's brilliant dude, still work or back now working with Noma. He was doing the R&D in the R&D kitchen. So there were there were these interesting characters in a few different spaces around the restaurant who were all doing kind of R&D in slightly different ways. And yeah, the food lab got transported. I mean, literally, that we hired this giant shipping container, and they winched all the ovens off the boat, and actually they dropped one, and it smashed it. And also, it was during a Noma lunch service, so all of these
No way.
diners ate. Well, I don't know, I can't remember the price point then. Let's say
Yeah.
£300. They were having this very expensive, wonderful, momentous lunch, and this giant, like, articulated lorry pulled out the front and was winching, oven. So I think that wasn't the nicest experience for the diners that day. But yeah, the food lab moved. That was 2014. Moved to the university, and then it existed
Hmm.
as the Nordic Food Lab for a few more years, and then a couple of years ago, it got the name disappeared, and it just got
Yeah.
incorporated into KU's kind of food science work. But the Food Lab and obviously Noma, and then the Noma's fermentation lab have given birth to this giant family tree of people doing awesome awesome things, fermentation, food innovation, and now, lots of food tech companies have been set up by people who are alums of the food lab or Noma, the restaurant, or the fermentation lab. And it's amazing to see. And obviously, like, Rene was the top of that kind of Christmas tree, and Klaus Meyer, who's this
Yeah.
entrepreneur who helped back Noma in the start, and those two, as well as lots of other people, really are responsible for lots of people going out into the world and doing all sorts of cool and awesome things.
And back when, Johnny, when you were over here, it was important for me to understand at what point did you see the lab, because it, as you said, it has gone through many changes. And so I mean, from what I understand, you've seen it at a point where it is feeding the restaurant in a way. You're also actively working with people like Thomas, people who are primarily chefs and then have a certain interest into science, whereas you are primarily into science and have an interest into how to apply that to food. So my question is more like, I mean, of course, I'm a witness of it, and there are definite problems and mixing these worlds, but there's a lot of benefit which comes when you go beyond that problematic stage. So if you could share of some, like, I don't know, anecdotes or the way a scientist work, the way a chefs work. I mean, chefs are not the best people to document things, whereas science depends on documenting. So things like this, especially in something so sensitive like fermentation, how was, like, did you change your ways, or did people around change their ways? How did you find the balance?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. So when I went over to the food lab, I'd basically been spent 10 years in, like, at, the world of academy, so in
Uh-huh.
universities. And I had a bit of restaurant experience at that point. And I guess the food lab really was this kind of hybrid space. But people like Josh Evans were so good at requesting that you document everything in notes, just taking pictures of everything as well. So there were definitely these practices borrowed from the world of science that were being put into play there. And actually, in the subsequent 10 years, a bunch of my work really has been just this person who has had a foot in both camps. I've worked in kitchens, I've worked as a chef, and I've worked as a scientist, and just understanding how different those two groups of people are, and that realizing that they speak very different languages. And that I've definitely done some roles, jobs, projects where literally my job really is to just understand that, and to act as a sort of go-between or a diplomat. Like you say, as a scientist, typically have lots of time to do things. They
Mm-hmm.
they'll do multiple iterations of something. So you test in triplicate. So we won't make one batch of meringue, we'll make three, and then we'll change one variable. So we'll do another three meringues, and then we'll change
Uh-huh.
another variable, and that's another three. So we've got 27 meringues, and we'll taste them all, or we'll measure something about all of them. Whereas often, in a kitchen, you have very little time. People are doing R&D, or in lots of restaurants, they don't have a test kitchen or an R&D lab. You're creating new dishes between services or at the end of the night. You don't have much time and space, and you're maybe making one iteration of something, and you stick your finger in it and you taste it and you go, I think that needs more X or Y, and you pass it along the bench, and someone else says, oh, well, I disagree, I think that needs less Y and more Z. It's very like, trial and error, sorry. And you're
Yeah.
maybe not measuring things, and you're probably not documenting things. And there's a kind of hierarchy of decision making. So if the head chef likes something, then maybe it will get the green light. And if they don't, maybe it'll be stuck in a kind of an orange light or a red light. So they work in such different ways, and yeah, translating between those two groups, and sometimes managing expectations has been a big part of what I've done, because people have these lofty ambitions of, like, let's create this product or this product, or let's create this program of fermented beverages or fermented whatever, and people don't understand how much time and space and dedication is required. And so sometimes my job is merely like managing expectations, and but yeah, helping those two groups of people talk to each other. And yeah, lots of chefs have good intuition, but they're going to get probably stuck on, if you start talking about microbes or the life cycles of microbes or certain technical knowledge. And so breaking down the complexity of some of that biology or microbiology to a level where a head chef or a sous chef or a CDP or even a stagiaire will, irrespective of what they've done in their past, might be able to understand. But it's definitely difficult, and I think probably now, even versus 10 years ago, there are so many more um, you know so much more information and training manuals online, but obviously now there's lots of books. The Noma book being one, but Sandal Cats being another great one. The Koji Alchemy by Rich and Jeremy being another great one. Before those books existed, it was sort of people burying their heads in textbooks or in what then felt like funny corners of the internet, or just kind of trying things. I remember trying these things where I didn't know if you could grow this organism on this substrate and just being like, well, in principle, you should be able to do this. And now there's lots of documentation, which it means that the chef in an average restaurant doesn't have to have Michelin stars, might be, better armed and better educated. And that's, been one of the awesome things to see in the last 10 years.
Uh-huh. And like, how much role in all of this, what you mentioned, does culture play? Because I can imagine, like, I don't know, Copenhagen back in 2014, where everything is just happening. Everybody wants to like get on that ship. People are traveling all across the world to be in Copenhagen. So I think there's also a certain amount of say risk factor too, because there's a certain expectation from you, from the chef himself, and the chef expecting the same from an expert in the field like you. And say doing that, because I've also read somewhere you worked with others, like you worked with Mirazur on projects as well, and other restaurants which are, say, not that much into, say, they're not places known for tech innovations. It's more known for their produce, or more known for, yeah, French, for example, of very different scenarios. And then, like, recently you in Mexico, for example. So all these cultures, and how ahead or how behind are they in that innovation train? Does that somehow set the narrative for you on what is expected of you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, when you're up at that very lofty level of like 2 or 3 Michelin stars, there's I think it's so tricky. There is a tendency to not want to rock the boat too much. And so you definitely, especially some of these restaurants that are from a very sort of classical canon. Flavor is sort of king, and then consistency is queen. Is how I normally describe it. You
Uh-huh.
need whatever you put on the menu. This Tuesday the 15th, it has to be the same as Thursday the 27th, and then that has to be the same of in a month's time, in 3 months' time. So techniques like fermentation, where inherently there is maybe more scope for deviation and change, than like cutting a bit of carrot and steaming it, or roasting a piece of meat. um, there's something about fermentation which kind of runs or is scary or at odds with how those kind of fancy, like canonical restaurants might want to
Mm-hmm.
produce ingredients and food. So I think whilst fermentation was definitely adopted and embraced by lots of restaurants around the world, there were some cooking from a certain sort of cultural context for whom it was it was not something that they immediately wanted to embrace or introduce. And obviously fair play, because they were doing their own thing and they were doing it brilliantly. But just even in this last kind of 12 months, I've done, I've been to restaurants like the Waterside Inn, which is the oldest
Uh-huh.
three-star Michelin three-star in Britain. Last week I was in Le Manoir de Quatre Saisons, Raymond Blanc's restaurant. So these are places which are very traditional. And I think, even 5 years ago, wouldn't have really wanted to explore um, some elements of fermentation, but obviously they were making amazing bread. They were using amazing yogurt and butter. They were using fermentation or fermented products, but now they're kind of, more open and curious to this idea of what other things fermentation might unlock for them. And actually, they're very interested in it as a the gateway to unlocking sustainability and sort of food waste goals. So I think, but that was always a constraint of some restaurants that I would talk to and work with, was this idea of consistency. And you can obviously create consistent products from ferments, but it just requires a bit more technical know-how and typically, yeah, a bit more time and space and then resources. And, lots of, I think the average person on the street imagines that 2, 3 Michelin star restaurants are like dripping with money because they're expensive to go.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that cash flow is very tough for lots of those high-end restaurants, for lots of restaurants, and they don't have lots of resources often to throw at things. So yeah, that just the ability to adequately resource something is tricky for lots of people.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you said. It's also highlighted this other edge of creativity, which is like there's always a compromise between either there's craftsmanship or there is scalability, and many restaurants are suffering that now because I think the same factor that you suffered of like suffered, but in the sense of like understanding that restaurants want a certain amount of control and standardization. Whereas there are restaurants which don't want it. Like I worked in Mugaritz for years, and no one plate, like no two plates look the same, and that's their ideology. But also that Mugaritz being Mugaritz. But what I was mentioning is that how restaurants like say Noma, which have a public in the restaurant, to cater over there in the restaurant, I think it has to be uniqueness is somehow appreciated if every batch is different, just like the wine world. But then again, a company like that going into say Noma projects where you're selling in retail, now you can't permit the same kind of uniqueness to every bottle, maybe to every batch. Or like I was speaking to Joachim from Muri Drinks, and they are saying the same in Muri Drinks as well. They are like developing things. They are treating that as the wine business, like everything has their own edition of this year tastes like this, but there has to be some certain amount of standardization, and it's
Yeah.
not an easy game to play, I guess.
No, but there's deep historical precedent for that. If you look at the world of whiskey, blended whiskies were invented or kind of innovated, or with the idea of providing something that was more consistent year on year. Prior to that, I think it was William Grant who first blended whiskies. Prior to that, there were lots and lots of different distillers, and your one batch would be very different from the other. So you just didn't, as a consumer, you didn't really know what you were going to get, and so they had this idea, well, if we just stockpile and then blend, and then every year we'll try and create something that's very close to the blend of this particular mark. And so obviously that's what they now do. And so you have master blenders who will have access to whatever hundreds of different barrels, and it's up to them to say, well, let's mix 4 parts of this barrel with 2 parts of this barrel and a tiny bit of that, and we'll have something that tastes like the last 20 years of this particular whiskey. So that is it's a problem that other people in other food and drink categories that also
Mm-hmm.
fermentation have been battling for years. And if you look at whiskey, it's turned into something that's a positive. You have the blended whiskies, which are consistent and you know what you're going to get, but then you also have your your single malts and your single casks where it's more highly prized because it's going to taste a bit wackier, and it might not be to everyone's taste. But if you find a single single cask whiskey that you love, then it's probably going to be much more interesting than the kind of blended one.
Yeah, no, totally. I think there are definitely use cases in the world of fermentation. Also, we cannot at no point forget that the nature of fermentation is it is alive and it will demand things which we should associate to a living organism and not a commercial product. So yeah, I think that's something I think we'll see more of how different people approach this kind of problem, and I think there'll be some interesting answers coming out of it. But switching here from like towards from your whole I would say consultancy side of things, of involving yourself on external advisor and external expert sort of way into more of your current projects. Like I think the one which I've been very interested in. I think you also were a part of the Culinary Action initiative from Basque Culinary Center with the Win-Win chocolate. I think that has been something very up and coming. I think a lot of people have tried to answer this. It's a multifaceted issue of how chocolates are produced, the democracy around it, the politics around it, sourcing of it, sustainable factor of it, the nutritional aspect of it. There's so many things you can look at. So how is that like? How did that come up? Why this venture, and how's it going at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew going back to where I lived and my family again. I grew up about 10-minute drive from this big purple chocolate factory, famous
Mm-hmm.
chocolate factory in Birmingham. And I actually went to art college after A level. So after high school, I did this 1 year
Mm-hmm.
art foundation, and I planned to, again, talking about doing slightly weird things in life and making odd decisions. I wanted at that point to go and study fine art, and I wanted to become a painter. Um, so I did this art foundation there, and it was in this village called Bourneville where the chocolate factory is. And on certain days, you could smell the roasting, the roasting of the chocolate beans, or it smelled like chocolate. Maybe they don't roast them there anymore, but so I'd always had a deep love of chocolate. I know some people would argue that that particular make of chocolate is not real chocolate, but anyway, uh,
Mm-hmm.
we can ignore that complex conversation as well for the minute. I'd always eaten a lot of chocolate and loved chocolate, and I co-founded Win-Win Food Labs with my co-founder, Aram Pak. She came from a sort of business, finance, consultancy background. Co-founded that 4 years ago, but I'd had that idea about 6 or 7 years ago. I think my parents moved house in 2017, and I know that this experience happened in the old house where I grew up. So it was at least 7 years ago, but I was basically cooking these potatoes. Little, there wasn't much food in. I'd gone back for over a holiday, and I was boiling these potatoes. It was kind of all there was in, and they were slightly green and gnarly. And as I was boiling them, I leant over the pan and I smelt the steam, and it smelled like hot chocolate. It was this very odd experience, and so I had this light bulb go off. I was like, "Ah, there must be something in the potato skins, presumably, that
Mm-hmm.
some chemical compound that is mirrored is also found in chocolate." And so that sent my mind racing, like, oh, why does chocolate taste like chocolate? And then could you make something that tastes like chocolate from something that is not a cocoa bean? So potatoes was the original like source point, but ultimately, we never used potatoes. But my dream, I mean, potatoes have a really interesting history, and from Central South America, but we take them, they're an unglamorous food stuff, right? And I grew up eating a lot of potatoes. I love potatoes, but they're really like unglamorous. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Roma did that amazing. That was the era that I was there. I think they won this dessert of the year. Rocio Sanchez made this roasted potato ice cream with a plum. There's some plum kernel sauce with it or something, but there was this roasted potato ice cream on the menu, I think. But I like the idea of making, for me, what is a glamorous exotic ingredient, chocolate,
Mm-hmm.
for what for me is an unglamorous, unexotic ingredient, potatoes. So I had these dreams of using the same organisms that ferment cocoa beans, on potatoes. Ultimately, we took a different route using legumes and cereals, but that was the source material, I suppose. And it's interesting that actually potatoes come from basically the same part of the world where cocoa beans
Sure.
origin um, came from. But that company now, I actually stepped aside from the day-to-day running of it last year.
Mm-hmm.
The company's going great. The team is awesome and are doing brilliant things. And actually, since we founded it, there are now there have been a bunch of sort of copycat companies basically doing what we were doing. There were sort of three first mover companies, of which we were one. There was a Planet A in Germany, and a company called oh, company in the US whose name I'm skipping on. But anyway, now there are about
Okay.
10 or so people operating in this chocolate space, and so there are people doing cocoa-free chocolate, and then there are people also doing something slightly different, just basically trying to culture cocoa cells, but not growing them on a tree. So you
Wow.
a kind of cocoa stem cell, and you grow it in a petri dish or a bioreactor. So you end up with a mass that is biologically, genetically identical to the mass that is found in a cocoa bean, but it's just been brewed instead of grown on a tree. So there's that
Mm-hmm.
alternative approach. But fundamentally, what connects all of those people is this realization that the world of that the world loves chocolate, but that much of the world's chocolate is grown in ways which are damaging for the environment. So cocoa has a huge carbon footprint, uses
Mm-hmm.
an awful lot of water, even though it's grown in tropics. It's still a very thirsty plant. And also, there's about 1.5 million slave laborers involved in the production of cocoa in Ivory Coast and Ghana, so in West Africa, where 66%, give or take, of the world's cocoa beans come from. So there's this very deep, dark secret to the chocolate that will be in a chocolate bar that you buy in a supermarket or in a grocery store. Obviously, there's good cocoa produced in ethical, sustainable ways, but that is a very small percentage of what makes up most of the world's cocoa. And then if you look at climatic change, um, and the consequences of that, which are that there are all sorts of diseases which didn't used to affect cocoa crops, which are becoming
Mm-hmm.
serious, and then droughts and floods, sometimes within the same calendar year. You've got cocoa growing regions where there's a flood and then there's a drought, and then you're getting diseases which they didn't used to have to deal with. That's resulting in basically a decrease in supply, whilst the world's appetite for chocolate is increasing. So you have this supply demand crunch. So even if you don't care about humans growing cocoa and the lives they live, even if you don't care about the environment, um, we might struggle to grow the cocoa that we need, or it might cost much more in the future. So there's lots of good reasons to care about creating sustainable alternatives to cocoa. And I'll just finish on that just to say that, I love cocoa and I want the world to have more cocoa, but I also think that these alternatives offer an interesting and useful sustainable pillar alongside better cocoa as well.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely sounds like such an interesting idea. I mean, creative by itself for like as you said, finding something as luxurious from something so humble, which we have found it to be humble all this while. But also, I think it also is one more example of all these innovation into like retail food that we are seeing, like not coming from FMCG, not coming from the big brands, but coming from you or coming from like I know Matt Orlando is working on a similar project. He's done before something with caramel through wasted sourdough. There's Malcolm Livingstone second doing something with ice creams in the States. There is, I mean, Empirical came through Lars. So all these big, I mean, things which are like being reference brands today are coming through people who do not really have a background in how to run a big FMCG sector, and also seeing like the new how FMCG also is changing of sorts, like how Pepsi has now bought this startup, which used to be just the Poppy brand with the functional drinks. So things like that, and based on this new form of innovation, where people individually are solving these problems on a small scale and then trying to scale it up, how do you see the future of food systems?
Yeah, big question. I mean, I think, it's really interesting though, the big players, so if you go back 20 years, let's say, you would sell products in supermarkets,
Mm-hmm.
and then you would market products in newspapers or on TV or maybe in cinemas. And if you fast forward now, 2025, there are many more channels through which you sell or can sell, and there are many, many more channels through which you can market. So it's become much more fragmented. So in the olden days, the PepsiCos of the world or the Unilevers had a much easier job. They knew where they needed their product to be, what kind of shelf, and they knew how to reach their audience. And these days, the audiences are much more fragmented. So when you look at PepsiCo buying a company like the one they bought recently, they're as much buying the product as they are basically just trying to capture audience who were not perhaps accessible to them with their more traditional, maybe more conservative marketing approaches. So give me 1 second, Furqan. I'll just.
That's all right. That's all right. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, yeah. We have a baby on the call for the last couple of minutes.
Oh, that's all right.
We can.
Perfect.
So I'll try and jump in back in place. So what you're seeing is, yeah, much more fragmentation in all aspects of the market. So again, whereas new products used to be brought to market by these big corps, now you'll get
Mm-hmm.
ex-chefs or people who used to work front of house or people who used to work in law or teaching, and they get bored and they start up a company, a condiment company or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll see more of that. And I think because it's the barriers to starting a company, getting a food product off the ground are much lower than they used to be. It allows more people to step into these spaces. If you look at, you mentioned Malcolm Livingstone, Ghetto Gap have been doing such cool work in the States, championing products from cultures that were typically very underrepresented by big corporations. And so I don't know all of the products that they've released, but the ones I've seen, yeah, super cool. And their work is brilliant, really. And you wouldn't have, I don't think you'd have seen products like that on the shelf even 10 years ago. So it's definitely changing. But yeah, what does the future of food look like? I think we'll definitely see more brands popping up from these unexpected places. And then, more, gut health obviously is huge at the minute, but as we understand more about how, human body works and how diet interfaces with that, we will see more kind of product aimed at supporting good gut health and supporting sort of, personalized health outcomes. And I know there's a lot of chat around food as medicine, and this some people think that's a
Mm-hmm.
kind of dirty phrase, but I think certainly seeing the kind of convergence of those two worlds and an understanding of what you eat has really, 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 really important consequences on how you feel and how long you might live and what sort of quality of life you might have. I think that those two worlds will continue to converge further.
Mm-hmm. Oh, perfect. Also, for those listening on audio, right now we have a baby on board, so that's why if you're hearing some random noises on the background,
And he's
it's
actually
Johnny's
dressed in a
kid.
little onesie which has got orange.
Ah, yeah, couldn't be more thematic. But yeah, for those watching on video, there's a little treat for you for the last 5 minutes. And Johnny, just to not keep you holding anymore, but could you tell us about things you're excited in the future from like personal things that you're excited for? I know you have a book coming out. I think it might be out actually by the time you publish this.
Mm.
Adventures in Fermentation. So if you could just quickly tell us about the book and any other things that we are looking forward from you.
Yes, Adventures in Fermentation it's sort of a memoir, I guess. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
it recounts this sort of last 10 years of my life, which has involved working with the best restaurants in the world and bars and gallivanting around the world and meeting producers and farmers and fermenters and talking to people about food and breaking bread with them and learning and how to do things from awesome people, and then also sharing that knowledge with now probably like thousands and thousands of people, I guess. So it's full of some of these stories of like getting arrested and accidentally poisoning myself and various other things. And so it's mostly memoir, but it digs into the science of fermentation, the science of gut health, and then there's a few at the end of some of the chapters. There's these kind of recipes, and I guess I spent a lot of time in academia, and academia can be very elitist. There's a sort of badge of honor in
Mm-hmm.
in academia of if you can describe something in a way that means that other people don't understand what you're talking about. That's seen, that's worn as a badge of honor, and I hate that. I
Mm-hmm.
constantly want to try to make access to knowledge, as open and accessible as possible, and to explain complex ideas in a way that anyone can understand. So part of the book, I guess, is my bid to demystify um, fermentation, and I think still there are times when is communicated in a way that makes it sound more complex than it is, because fundamentally humans have been doing this for like 10,000 years and largely doing it successfully and creating delicious things. And so it should be possible, whether you're in a kitchen in a maisonette in Birmingham or in the world's best restaurant in Copenhagen or wherever. You should be able to ferment, and I would love more people in the future to be fermenting and fundamentally just making their own cooking at home, because that's really disappearing. I would love to see cookery back on educational curricula as well all around the world, because I think we've lost that. So yeah, the book kind of covers some of that in a hopefully pithy, funny, accessible way. So I suppose, I mean, it's my first book, so I have no ideas what will happen, but I'm looking forward to going out into the world and talking to people about it. And yeah, at the minute, I'll be probably doing some pop-ups off around the launch of the book. So I just did one in Mexico City with this awesome
Mm-hmm.
called Baldio. And so I'm excited about doing more things like that. And then there's a few, unfortunately, right this minute, I can't talk about my next big thing, but I'm kind of working on some cool new sort of business entrepreneurship fermentation
Mm-hmm.
projects, which I'm very excited to share. But yeah, if I compare the landscape of fermentation 2025 to 10 years ago, it's so much richer and more vibrant, and there are so many more participants, and there are so many more important voices that were just not there 10 years ago. And so yeah, I'm just excited to see how that develops in the next decade.
Yeah, and so are we, Johnny. I mean, about the book, about your adventures, about the pop-ups. We are really looking forward to what comes out of this. I think it's people like you who don't, like, as you said, your purpose being to make this more accessible, especially when it comes from people like you who have stepped into fields they didn't know much about from the fields that they knew a lot about. I think it's this kind of approach of showing that it's possible by me and it's possible for others as well. So I think it's going to be very interesting. I mean, fermentation is a topic with a lot of literature on it, but your touch to it, especially with those stories, yeah, super looking forward to it. And yeah, I would not keep you holding anymore. But Johnny, before you leave, if you had any words for people listening to you who want to do crazy, adventurous careers like yours and step into these different paths, what would be something you would like to close with?
I mean, I actually get a lot of sort of DMs and
Mm-hmm.
questions these days. People say, I'm so very lucky. They say like, your career looks amazing. Like, how did you start doing it, and how do I do, something like that? Basically, I get to
Mm-hmm.
go around and talk to people and eat food and drink, drink. It's pretty nice, and get paid for it. Um, I mean, I think just kind of start really. When didn't have a formal background in food, but I knew the things that I was good at, and I knew I was good at solving challenges. And so I tried to take that skill set that I did have, identify where in the world of food it might be useful, and then apply it. Because actually, I suppose I didn't say this, but when I finished that PhD, I wanted to become a chef. And I very quickly realized that although I have worked as a chef and a cook, that there are better cooks and chefs out there. And I realized that, yeah, the skills I had could be applied in this particular niche, and that was going to be better for me and better for other people as well. So I think it's about understanding what you can bring to the table, and then just going for it. But mostly people in the world of food and drink and farmers and winemakers and all these people, you know, they're not like lawyers and bankers. No one's there for the money, right? They're doing it
Mm-hmm.
largely, maybe some of them are, but largely there because they're in a kitchen because they care and they love food, or they love growing grapes and making wine. And so if you reach out to these people, often they will give you the time of day, and they will ask you, um, they will answer your questions. And so I would say, if I give one single pithy piece of advice, it is to ask for help, ask questions. If there's somebody who you really admire, there was this guy Patrick Johansson, the butter Viking, who made Noma's butter, and I was in awe of him. And I messaged him before I'd applied to go to the Nordic Food Lab, and he replied, and I was like, wow, the Viking himself has, bothered to reply to me. And yeah, most people will reply and be very nice about it, and yeah, ask for advice essentially.
Lovely, Johnny. It's been a great conversation, and I think you've left us with something to really think about. That to see possibilities where you see challenges, and just ask and approach people. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I hope some people listening to this can get inspired by this.
Thanks so much.